Hi, I'm Katie Miranda, and today I am here with Neta Golan. Neta is one of the founders of the International Solidarity Movement, ISM. And Neta and I met for the first time back in 2005 when I joined ISM. And she sort of became my activist role model. One of the first stories I heard about her is when she chained herself to an olive tree that was in a olive orchard that was about to get demolished. So that's when she became my activist role model. And Neta has kind of an interesting backstory. She is an Israeli who married a Palestinian and now lives with her family in Nablus. And this is actually something that is technically illegal. Israelis are not allowed to live in Area A, in Nablus. So they have basically a illegal relationship, which is absolutely ridiculous and just another one of the symptoms of apartheid in the West Bank and Gaza and all of Palestine in general. So Neta, I am wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you formed ISM, like what was the impetus for forming ISM?
Well, in 2000, there were the first mass protests against globalization in Seattle, against the IMF, and when people, were like took to the streets. And I think that inspired people all over the world, seeing that. And then later that year, towards the end of that year, the second intifada broke out. And well, one thing was thinking all those people that are wanting to create a better world, they should come here. And we were there. There was a specific incident in this village called Haris, where at the time my now brother-in-law was working there, and he had told us that the village was totally closed, like shut. You couldn't leave. The villagers weren't allowed to leave even on foot, and all the access roads were blocked, and they couldn't access. It was olive harvest season. So I went there with a friend and an Israeli friend, and when we got there, the soldiers and the settlers were already, like, there was a confrontation. There were the soldiers and the settlers, and there was young Palestinians wanting to open the access road, the main access road to the village. And we stood in the middle between the soldiers and the settlers and the Shabab. And they could open the road without getting shot. The soldiers didn't shoot because we were there. And that was a horrifying and life-changing moment, realizing that that because I was standing there, people could try to protest, resist, try to survive under, while the occupation was trying to strangle them. And that my presence could prevent live ammunition from being used. And that, I guess, the sense of responsibility that came with that realization was something that pushed me. And then trying to get other people who are privileged by, the apartheid system here and kind of the global white supremacist system that are in place, yeah, to come and join forces with people trying to resist apartheid in Palestine.
Now you told me you're working on kind of what's a new branch of ISM called Return Solidarity. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the group is called Return, and it's basically um, activists working in solidarity with the Great March of Return. And because um, accessing Gaza at the moment is almost impossible, um, basically most of the people, the majority of the group are Israelis that are in coordination with Palestinian organizers of the Great March and activists in Gaza. Uh, we are protesting together with them it's east of the fence, actually, right?
Yeah.
east, east and north, but we're on the east of the fence. And we're protesting in solidarity with the Great March of Return, but also for the right of return. It's the first demonstration of Jewish Israelis for the right of return. Um, and it's kind of raising to the occasion to meet the Great March of Return and Palestinians' demand to come home.
So is it kind of like you guys both come to your own sides of the fence and you communicate with each other, or how does that work? I know you mentioned you guys tried to have a tea party with the Palestinians on
Mm-hmm.
the other side.
We were invited at some point by Palestinian activists for a tea party, and yeah, so we all came with tea in cups, but they couldn't make it. So we lifted our Palestinian flags um, and demonstrated together. But yeah, we come uh, like we've done different things, but mostly while there are protests, um, uh, we're there and we have flags and banners that are large and can be seen by the Palestinians on the other side. Yeah, and then we talk over the phone. Basically, we have a loudspeaker, so we can talk to each other. We can see each other from the distance, and we can talk to each other. We're hoping to be able to get closer, and obviously, we're hoping to be able to really meet in the flesh, and for them to be able to come back to their homeland, and for us to be able to have tea.
And what has been the reaction of the Israeli soldiers to this? Do they try and get you to leave, or do they shoot the Palestinians, or what happens?
So, yeah, they're shooting at the Palestinians. The demonstrations are happening. We're not. The demonstration isn't happening because we're there. The demonstration is happening anyway, and the Palestinians are getting shot at by snipers. They shoot at the demonstrations from tanks on a regular basis.
So are the Israeli soldiers trying to tell you guys to go away, or what?
Yeah, they do eventually forcefully remove us every time. At first, we would come and hang the posters of the martyrs at the fence. To be honest, it's taken a long time to kind of get the message across to Jewish Israelis who would want to protest in solidarity with the Great March of Return, that coming to the fence is even possible, and that coming to protest at the fence doesn't mean that you're going to get shot in the head. Because Palestinians who come to the fence are shot in the head on a regular basis, including children, including medics, including journalists, women. It's the racism of the system is often really hard to fathom. Like even for the people who are benefiting from the system, even for Jewish Israelis, it's sometimes difficult to grasp just how incredibly racist the system is and how incredibly privileged we are within that system. So initially, when I was trying to get people to go out to the fence, the response across the board was like, you're going to get shot in the head from both sides, kind of, which is, complete nonsense. Because if we're coordinated with the Palestinian side and we have Palestinian flags, yeah, people wave at us. People are so excited to see us, and for about 5 months there was also no one was shot. Not even Israeli soldiers were shot, while over 150 protesters were murdered in cold blood. Eventually, one Israeli soldier was shot during a demonstration, and another one was injured. From the Palestinian side, it's almost entirely, has been and is a completely nonviolent, unarmed protest. And from the Israeli side, they know very well, the soldiers, that if they shoot a Palestinian, kill them, murder them in cold blood, they'll get recognition, a pat on the back. There's absolutely no problem with that. That's what they're being told they should do.
That's sick.
While if they shoot an Israeli, well, if they shoot an Israeli, they know they'll get in trouble. And the first time we came, they really did not know what to do with us. And the second time, they were much more violent. But, basically the risk for us, and it depends on how close we want to get to the fence, and that also depends on what the Palestinians are asking of us. Then the risk is, we might get beaten, we might get arrested. And if we're arrested as Israelis, we're released, usually the same day, maximum after 24 hours. So it's really, the risk is negligent, while the people inside the ghetto who are protesting, their unlivable conditions are dying for it every time. So it's the absolute minimum that we can do when we're invited by them and asked by them to come and support them. So I'm happy to say that the fear barrier in people's mind is breaking, and more people are coming. It's still very much the beginning, but we had our last protest, we had 50 people, which is, still not barely as much as it should be, but much more than the 3 people I started with. So
I want to talk a little bit about lives that have been saved due to this nonviolent international solidarity. You mentioned that to me before. You want to talk about lives that have been saved and villages that have gotten their land back, and just what is working in terms of this international solidarity?
In Gaza, because of the siege imposed by Israel and Egypt, because there's basically no way for international volunteers to get into Gaza and to be there marching with the Palestinians. On a regular basis, demonstrations are met with live ammunition. Unarmed demonstration, live ammunition, tank shells, demonstrations have been fired at from helicopters, like in Gaza. They use tear gas from drones and stuff, but it's probably more just to then be able to sell it on the arms market, as something that's been tested. But they're not trying, there are unlethal means to use against demonstrations. While in the West Bank, in the beginning of the Second Intifada, this was very much the case, where I remember that when we would show up as internationals and, together with Palestinians at a demonstration, in the beginning of the Second Intifada, the soldiers were in tanks. They only had live ammunition. And in a way, if they didn't want to shoot us, which most of the time they didn't, not because they didn't want to, because they had orders not to, they pretty much didn't really have anything to use against us. Because they didn't want, because using live ammunitions against internationals or a mixed crowd where an international could be shot was a problem, and that's all they had. So I remember demonstrations were like with the students in Bir Zayt, the road was closed to Ramallah, and there would be a tank there, and we'd move forward, and they would shoot warning shots, and we would stop. And then, move forward a little bit and they would shoot warning shots. Or when we entered as a group of internationals, when we entered the President Arafat's compound, and I remember there was a tank and there was a guy in the tank, and at first he had some sound bombs, so he threw sound bombs, and we were like, okay, it's just sound bombs, just keep going. And then he started shooting live ammunition, but around us, not at us. And we were like, it's just warning shots, just keep going. Because it's true, because if they're shooting warning shots, like from experience, when they shoot warning shots, it means they don't want to shoot you. When they want to kill somebody, when they killed Rachel, when they killed Tom, no warning shots. They just do it. So, warning shots are a good sign, and it doesn't mean keep running. But in the case of the President Arafat's company, we kept going, and we got in basically before they decided what to do with this mixed group. We could break the siege and enter. And our being present, changed. For example, if I move to that example of being inside President Arafat's compound in 2002, during the invasion, when the compound was under siege. So when we entered, 3 people inside the compound had already been killed. One of them, for example, the windows had like metal bar, like were shuttered. But when somebody moved behind them, the Israeli snipers on the other side saw a shadow, so they shot, and they killed the person. So at first, when we arrived, we had to like kind of duck under the windows every time, and the walls of the building were kind of like Swiss cheese, because you had these like small bullet holes and larger like shell holes, and there was a lot of shooting. But the presence of like 30 French people and a few, and other internationals there, it completely changed that situation. And that's just one example. But if I go back to talking about the Great March of Return and the difference between Gaza and the West Bank, the presence of international and Israeli activists with Palestinians at demonstrations, the reason that the Palestinians invite us to the demonstrations is that when we are present, they are forced to use less lethal means. So here in the West Bank, they started using these 2.2 caliber bullets, like small live bullets that a sniper can shoot. And they try to identify, they do their best to shoot Palestinians with it and not the internationals in the crowd. It is less lethal. It can kill, and it has killed protesters. But yeah, they don't make this effort in Gaza because it's Palestinians by themselves, and on the contrary, they're using bullets that are causing amputations when they hit. And they could, for control of a crowd that's completely illegal, completely unnecessary. But obviously, they're doing it to try to deter people for protesting. So they're murdering people, but they're also maiming an entire generation of Palestinians in Gaza. It's thousands. So like the number of injured is and the kind of injuries are just horrific. So that's the difference in my, like, I saw that change in the West Bank. I saw them move from live ammunition to having to use less lethal means. And once in a court case, before they had the 2.2, the small live bullets, there were Israeli activists that were put on trial. But in the trial, there were, because as Israelis, we get a real trial, like even when we're accused. So their lawyer could, question the soldiers. And she asked, Gabi Lasky asked the soldiers, do you have different orders when Israelis are present? And they said, yes, if Israelis are present, we're not allowed to use live ammunition. So that changed with the 2.2, but it's just an indication. So in Bil'in, for example, if there were Palestinians alone trying to do something and soldiers would come, they would pretend, they would scream to the Palestinians, in English, internationals over here, and in Hebrew, Israelis go over there, so that the soldiers think that it's a mixed crowd, because that could
save somebody's life.
It could save lives together. they're forced to use less lethal means. And I think that's part of the purpose of the siege of Gaza, is keeping them isolated from any kind of support, and starving them, trying to starve them into submission, of course.
You
But
mentioned earlier another case, Sharon Lied. Do you want to talk
yeah,
about that?
so I mean, there are, when we did have ISM volunteers in Gaza, which I pray and hope that we will have again somehow soon, despite the fact that the siege is making it impossible right now. Yeah, there were many cases in which their presence saved lives. Another one of the ISM co-founders, Ghassan Andoni, he I remember would say that, like, occupation thrives in the dark, and when you shed light on an occupation policy long enough, Israel is forced to change it. And I have seen those kinds of successes that have changed Israeli policy as well in other cases. But in the case with Sharon, so she was, the ISM volunteers at the time were going out with the ambulances. And I remember I was freaking out. I didn't want them to. I was really scared.
This is in Gaza?
But in Gaza,
Uh-huh.
yes. And yeah, and ambulances are and were being targeted, like, so being in the ambulances was extremely dangerous. And yeah, the way ISM works, because, and I think this is one of the things that work, is because ISM is a non-hierarchical organization, and so, and the groups on the ground take decisions by consensus, which means that, for example, in the case of the volunteers going out, the ambulances, they didn't listen to me, which at the time was like, I was very, very scared. Thank God they survived. I didn't think they would. But Sharon was based in a hospital in Tel El Hawa, and there was snipers were took up a position outside the entrance of the hospital, and there was heavy fighting in the neighborhood. So people that were in danger in their homes would try to take refuge in the hospital, and then these snipers positioned near the entrance would shoot at them. And we were trying to ask activists to contact, their representatives, and to contact Israeli politicians, and, to demand that this stop, without much success. And then, unfortunately, like, as I was on the phone with her, a family was trying to take refuge in the hospital, and the little girl was shot in the face and in the stomach, and the father was shot in the thigh. And because this happened, the campaign, picked up. Like, when we told people that this had happened, and we reiterated the need to do something, then more people were calling. And I actually got a call from an Israeli politician, who at the time was on some kind of the Committee for Defense, whatever, which was like the most surreal conversation I've ever had in my life. But something changed from the attention that situation got, and people in the neighborhood a couple of hours later were told that they could take a white flag and evacuate to the hospital. And then from the hospital, they were allowed to evacuate, not in ambulances, just on foot. And we're talking about like hospital and sick people, but to evacuate from there to somewhere else. And as far to a UN school, which, there was nowhere safe in Gaza, but they did it because it was safer than where they were And as far as I know, that's the only case in the 2012 massacre that such considerations were taken. And I'm convinced that it's because of the attention and the calls that the attention that was got, and the fact that people reached out to their representatives, and their representatives were pressuring Israeli politicians, and Israeli politicians were like, okay, we're being like exposed in this particular situation. Let's do the right thing here. There are many others. There's other insane things, like in the 2012 massacre in Gaza. So they were using the Israelis were using phosphorate. What do you call it?
White phosphorus.
White phosphorus. Yeah. And it was clear that this is what they were using. I mean, they were, you could see it in the video, and people were getting these burns that wouldn't stop burning, and, horrific. But the evidence was so clear, right? We could all see it. But no paper the Israelis were denying it. The Israelis were saying, no, we're not using it. So nobody published it. All the supposed, I don't know what, objective, media were not believing their eyes and what was happening, but were not publishing that they were using white phosphorus because they were claiming that they weren't. I don't know. And then our volunteers on the ground, had to interview the doctors about the kinds of the wounds and try to get evidence, and until finally, somebody picked that up, had the guts to cover that, not to claim that the Israelis were using it, but to bring doctors' testimonies that the Israelis were using it. Mm-hmm. I don't know that this actually changed lives, but it's saved any lives. But it was.
It's an example of the purpose that international solidarity activists can serve in the West Bank and Gaza.
Yeah. So we've mostly been talking about Gaza, which is definitely, kind of, where my heart is at the moment. But in the West Bank, Palestinians invite Israelis and internationals to join their demonstrations because they know that it allows them to demonstrate at less risk, not without risk.
There have been other successes too, right? Villages getting their land back as a result of these demonstrations.
In the demonstrations against the apartheid wall, the route was, and it's a combination of many things, it's not the demonstrations by themselves. It's the demonstrations together with the international, diplomatic pressure, together with the ICJ at the time, that demonstrations alone is not enough. Palestinians, they're going out on the ground and they need people to be here to support them, but they also need people back home to be putting, pressure on their governments, and to be implementing, campaigns of boycott, divestment, and sanctions to pressure Israel. And the combination of all our efforts together means that sometimes, when Israel, when the occupation authorities are kind of having to decide, is it worth it? Okay, we can steal all this land, but we might get consequence. So when there are consequences, when we can generate consequence, which is what the BDS campaign is trying to do, finally, discussion about that's happening now, arms embargo, or about suspending trade agreements, then they back off in certain times. Some of the villages, Budrus, Biddu, Belin, some of them got all their land back. Berlin got half of their land that was going to be stolen by the wall. They're still cut off from the rest of historical Palestine by the apartheid wall, but Israel, grabbed less than it wanted to due to this combination of pressure. And the Israeli and international volunteers that were invited to join the demonstrations were part of that, part of those successes. There's other campaigns, the campaign for the right to enter, Um, and even the olive harvest, I talked about Haris. When in the beginning of the Second Intifada, Israel wanted to make it illegal for Palestinians to go out to their fields, and there was huge pushback against that. And then there was also the fact that when, the tactic that's used, and now we're entering olive harvest season in Palestine, but the tactics that is still being used is that Palestinians will go to their fields, they'll be attacked by settlers, soldiers will come, and instead of removing the settlers, of course, they'll tell the Palestinians to leave. So the settlers get what they want, which is the Palestinians leave the land. And when Israelis and international activists were there, and if they could get, media coverage for showing this cooperation, because this cooperation isn't something that Israel, wants exposed. They don't want it to be clear that the soldiers and the settlers are all like just basically two hands of the same body, which is very obvious. But still, they like to, it's useful to have like a paramilitary organization like the settlers, and then doing things that the army isn't supposed to do. And when we could show very clearly that collaboration, it embarrassed them. And now on their website, the way that they solved that, so we shed light on that apartheid policy, and they had to change it. And then they set up these like days where Palestinians are supposed to coordinate with the military to go pick their olives. Like they call them DCO days. And then they show on the IDF, on the IOF website, on the Occupation Forces like website, how the Israeli military is like accompanying the Palestinian soldiers
like
to
they're
help
doing a
them.
good deed or something.
Yeah, to protect them from the soldiers. But that, they did that because they were exposed.
Yeah.
And it's still a terrible situation. They're only allowed to, to be in their land for certain days when they coordinate with the army, and it's not enough. And but it's better
Than
than what
not
it
being
was.
able
So
to harvest at
you
all.
shed and the struggle continues. You shed light on a policy, and then they change it. And sometimes they manage to change it. Sometimes it's worse, sometimes it's better. But they change it, and then you have to start over. With the campaign for the right to entry, that's also they were denying spouses of Palestinians entry, and the campaign managed to pressure Europe, to pressure Israel, to change that. So the situation is still terrible, but there was major achievement.
Well, Neta, listening to these stories brings back a lot of memories for me, and I just wanted to let you know that, like, this is really weird for me to say, but I feel like I am who I am because you are who you are. Like, you had such a profound influence on me and my life, and so I just wanted to say thank you for that. Thank you for being you. It's the truth.
Thank you so much. That means a lot, and it's funny, but it makes me want to makes me want to talk about another thing that works.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Which is, going back to the non-hierarchical structure, because I'm like one person with very limited capacity, and I think that the reason that people like you and that so many people could plug in to the struggle, and for the struggle to become their own, and could come into ISM, and for ISM to become their own. Like there's so many ISMers, they have no idea who I or any of the other founders like are, and it's theirs because of the way that it functions, because of the non-hierarchical way that it functions. And I really, really like, I mean, I've seen it with the ISM. I see it now with the new group that I have returned. It's in some ways if you work like in a non-hierarchical way, it's a mess. It can be really confusing.
That's true.
You don't have any clear like plan, any clear leadership, many of the times, and you kind of have to trust uh, the group, which can sometimes be scary because not every individual in the group is always trustworthy. But what I've found is that if you use the process, really, if you use the process of consensus, which means that, everyone's concerns are heard and things can't move forward unless everyone agrees to that, can live with it, then people take responsible decisions together that can be flexible and responding, to the immediate situation. It gives like I find it to be an incredibly effective method, like both when we're on the ground, like when we started going to these demonstrations at the fence, the people because we were taught consensus by, like, we were lucky enough that the people, when we called for a campaign in Palestine, people that came were people from Seattle that were involved in the way that was organized. And they kind of taught us how to use it not only in meetings, but on the ground. And when I first started doing stuff with Return, people, it really freaked them out that I wouldn't, they'd be like, what do we do? And I'd say, like, what do we do? But
because they wanted you to tell them what to do.
Yeah.
And you weren't going to do that.
What do I know? No way.
Yeah.
There's no, but we could agree, and we did. So far, we've done great things, and it's theirs now. And they're putting the energy into it, I am too, but just as one person in the group. And so I have hope that just like ISM is something that, has a life of its own, and there's people like you, moving it forward without any connection to me. And I think the BDS movement is another great example of that, of how movements can work. And at least in the case of ISM, what I see now, that the non-hierarchical structure and trusting people and trusting the process of a group I've found it to be effective. And then it has benefits like, Israel tries to chop off the head and, doesn't really have a head. So that doesn't work,
Yeah. Yeah, that's really true. We are just about out of time now, so I want to thank you very much, Neta.
Thank you, Katie.